By the road stood a hand-painted sign, "Honey and Apples." Behind it, 200 white boxes hummed in long rows beside a stand of gnarled apple trees that everyone in Hollow Creek had pronounced dead 3 springs running. A gray-haired man walked between them, without hurry, without netting, while the whole hillside trembled with a sound like the earth breathing. Years earlier, on a colder morning, that same man leaned on his fence as his neighbor Walt shook his head at the orchard. "Some things you can't bring back, Eli," Walt said. "You just clear the ground and start fresh. Save yourself the heartache." Eli looked a long while at the bent, blossomless branches. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe a thing isn't gone just because it's tired. Sometimes it only needs the right kind of help showing up." Walt snorted and drove off. Eli Mercer was 61, and his hands had done a great many things in their time. They had folded a flag once, at a service for a friend, and the creases of that folding seemed to live in them still. He had come home to his father's farm 2 decades back, expecting to spend his quiet years among trees that had fed 3 generations of Mercers. For a while they had. Then the orchard began to fail. It was nothing dramatic. There was no single bad year a man could point to. The apples simply came smaller each season, and fewer, until the bushels he carried to the Saturday market in Hollow Creek would not fill the bed of his truck. The blossoms opened each spring, pink and white and hopeful, and then most of them dropped to the grass without ever becoming anything at all. He kept the place tidy regardless. He rose before dawn out of long habit, made coffee in a dented pot, and walked the rows in the gray light, touching the bark of trees he had known since boyhood. Their names were not written anywhere, but he knew them, the big northern spy near the well, the row of Baldwins his grandfather had grafted, the lone Gravenstein that leaned westward as if listening for something. His savings had thinned the way the orchard had, quietly a little each year. He did not complain. He patched what broke and went without what he could. The townsfolk were fond of him in the way small towns are fond of a man who keeps to himself and pays his debts. But fondness did not stop them from talking. At the feed store, at the diner, over fences, the verdict had settled into common wisdom. The Mercer orchard was finished. Old wood, played out. A shame, but there it was. The only one who never said so was Junie Park, who ran the diner counter and saved him the corner stool and a slice of pie on Saturdays. Junie was younger, sharp-eyed, raising a grandson named Theo, who was forever drawing in a battered notebook. She listened more than she spoke, and when she did speak to Eli, it was never about cutting anything down. Eli did not yet know what was wrong with his trees. He only knew that he was not ready to call them dead. A man did not bury what was merely sleeping. It was Theo who said it, of all people. The boy had wandered the orchard one Saturday, while Junie dropped off a pie, his notebook open, sketching the blossoms. He came running back to the porch, breathless. "Mr. Mercer, there's no bugs," he said. Eli set down his coffee. "How's that? In the flowers. I drew a whole tree, and there wasn't one bee. My teacher says flowers need bees to make fruit. The bees carry the dust from flower to flower." He frowned at his own page. "Your trees are real quiet." Eli stood slowly and walked into the rows he had walked 10,000 times. He stood beneath the leaning Gravenstein, full of open blossoms, and he listened. The boy was right. The silence he had taken for peace was something else entirely. Nothing moved among the flowers. Nothing at all. The orchard was not dying. It was lonely. That night Eli did not sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with a county library book Junie fetched for him the next morning, and he read the way he had once studied maps, slowly, completely, marking what mattered. The book told him what Theo had seen. An apple tree could not fruit itself. It needed pollen carried from another tree, blossom to blossom, and the carrying was done by bees. Wild bees had once done this work for free, drifting in from hedgerows and fence lines. But the hedgerows around Hollow Creek had been cleared for bigger fields, the wild colonies had dwindled, and somewhere in the slow arithmetic of years, his trees had simply stopped being visited. The blossoms opened. No one came. They closed and fell. It was not the wood. The wood was fine. The remedy, the books said plainly, was to bring the bees yourself. Orchardists rented or kept hives and set them among the trees at bloom, and the difference could be the difference between a barren spring and a heavy harvest. But the book spoke of a hive or two per acre. Eli had nearly 40 acres of trees, neglected and spread wide, and a bloom that came all at once and brief. To flood that much old, struggling orchard thoroughly, to give every far blossom a fair chance in the short window it stayed open. He would need not a hive or two. He would need hundreds. He sat back. 200 hives, near as he could figure. The cost rose up in his mind like a wall. Hives, bees, equipment, the long study of a craft he knew nothing about. It would take the better part of what he had left. If it failed, if he was wrong, if the trees truly were spent and the silence was only a symptom, he would be a broke old man with 200 boxes of bees and no orchard worth the name. Walt's voice came back to him. Save yourself the heartache. Clear the ground. It would be the sensible thing. Sell the timber, lease the cleared land, live small and safe on what remained. He went out before dawn and stood under the northern spy, the one nearest the well, the biggest of them all. His grandfather had planted it. His father had pruned it. Eli had climbed it as a boy and eaten its fruit warm off the branch. He laid his hand on the bark. It was not the bark of a dead thing. It was cool and alive and waiting. All right, he said quietly. All right then, let's find out. He drove 90 minutes the next day to a beekeeping supplier 2 counties over, a weathered operation run by a woman named Delia Voss, who had kept bees for 40 years. He told her plainly that he knew nothing and needed to learn everything, and that he intended to put 200 hives beside an orchard most people had given up on. Delia looked at him over her glasses for a long moment, taking his measure the way one careful person takes another. Most folks start with 2 hives and quit by August, she said. I'm not most folks, Eli said, and I don't quit. Something in how he said it made her nod slowly. No, she agreed. I don't believe you do. Let's get to work. Delia became his teacher, but Junie became something steadier. She started driving out midweek now, not only Saturdays, Theo in the back seat with his notebook. She'd bring coffee and sit on the porch while Eli described smoke and frames and the strange new language of his days. She never once told him it was foolish. My husband planted a fig tree the year before he passed, she said one evening. Everyone said it'd never fruit this far north. I still eat figs off it every fall. She looked at the orchard. People are awful quick to call things dead, Eli. I stopped listening to them a long time ago. The bees arrived in May, in stages, on the back of Delia's flatbed, and then Eli's truck running relay trips down the county road. The town noticed at once. You could not hide 200 beehives. They came in stacked white boxes, and Eli set them in long, neat rows along the southern edge of the orchard and threaded more between the trees themselves, spacing them by a plan he and Delia had drawn on the back of a feed bag. By the third day, the hum was something you could hear from the road, a low, steady chord that rose with the warmth of the morning and softened at dusk. Cars slowed. Walt stopped his truck at the fence one afternoon and sat watching with his elbow out the window and an expression caught between worry and disbelief. Ellie, he called, you have lost your mind. You can't see your own trees for all those boxes. And what happens when those things swarm and somebody's grandkid gets stung to pieces? They're gentle if you don't crowd them, Eli said, walking over slow smoke puffing from the little tin smoker in his hand. And I've kept them well off the road. Bees don't want trouble any more than I do. They just want the flowers. It looks dangerous, Walt said. It looks crazy. Folks are talking. Folks have been talking about my orchard for years, Eli said mildly. Hasn't grown me a single apple yet. Walt drove off shaking his head, and by supper time the diner had the whole story, embroidered. The bee man, 200 hives. Mercer had finally cracked. There was a strain of real concern in it, too. These were people who'd known him for decades. But concern and ridicule wear awfully similar faces over a cup of coffee. Eli let them talk. He had work to do, and the work consumed him in a way nothing had in years. It turned out that keeping bees was not one skill but 100 small ones, and he learned them with the patience of a man who had spent a life learning hard things slowly and well. Delia came twice a week at first, then weekly, and walked the rows with him, opening hives, reading them like pages. "You watch the bottom board for mites," she said, tilting a frame to the sun. "You watch the brood pattern, see how tight and even that is? That's a good queen. A gappy, scattered pattern, that's a queen failing. You learn to smell a healthy hive. Sweet, like warm wax and honey. A sour smell means trouble." Eli wrote none of it down. He didn't need to. He took it in through his hands, the way he'd once learned to do everything that mattered. He learned to move without fear, because fear traveled down through the fingers and the bees felt it. He learned the slow, deliberate breath that kept his hands steady when a frame came up boiling with insects. He learned to read the weather in their behavior, how they poured out thick before a warm day and stayed close before rain. He learned to lift the heavy supers with his knees and to rest when his back told him to, because there was no one to take over if he broke himself. The days fell into a rhythm older than the calendar. He rose in the dark, walked the rows by lantern, and was among the hives by the time the first foragers lifted off into the gray. He watched them find the blossoms. That, more than anything, was the thing he could not stop watching. A single bee landing on an apple flower, working it over, dusting itself gold, and lifting off toward the next. Theo came every Saturday and many days between, and Eli made him a small veil and let him stand at a careful distance with his notebook. The boy drew everything. He drew the hives and the frames and the slow gold drip of the first test of honey. He drew Eli, hunched and patient, a wisp of smoke rising. He labeled his drawings in careful block letters: worker, drone, queen. He started keeping a count of how many bees he could spot on a single tree, a number that had been 0 in April and was now too high to track. 41, Theo announced one morning, awed. "I counted 41 on the leany one before I lost count." Eli looked up at the Gravenstein, the lonely leaning tree that had stood silent for so many springs. It was not silent now. It shivered all over with movement, every open blossom holding a working bee, the whole tree singing. He had to turn away for a moment and busy his hands with the smoker. By June, the blossoms had finished their work and fallen, and the orchard entered the long green patience of summer. Now there were 2 harvests to tend at once, and Eli moved between them like a man working 2 farms laid over each other on the same ground. The bees, their pollinating done for the apples, turned to the wider country, to the clover in the ditches, the basswood down by the creek, the wildflowers in the fence lines that had grown up since the Schridrosos were cleared. They came home heavy. Eli added boxes to the tops of the hives to give them room, stacking the white supers higher until some of the rows stood taller than the boy. And in the trees, where for years the branches had hung nearly bare by this point in summer, something was happening that Eli almost did not trust himself to believe. Fruit was setting, not the scattered handful of recent years, a dozen apples to a tree, easily counted, easily mourned. The branches were stippled all over with tiny green knobs, hard and shy as peas, but everywhere. He walked the rows in the early light and counted on a single branch what the whole tree had given him the year before. He counted again to be sure. Then he stopped counting because the number kept rising and his chest did a thing it had not done in years. He told no one but Junie. He was afraid of saying it aloud to the town, afraid of the way hope curdles into a fresh kind of foolishness if it's spoken too soon and then fails. June apples could still drop. A storm could strip a tree. A man learns caution the hard way and keeps it. But he told Junie on the porch, in a low voice like a confession, "They're setting fruit, Junie. All of them. Even the spy, even the leaning one." He shook his head slowly. "I haven't seen anything like it since I was a boy." Junie reached over and squeezed his forearm once, firmly, and said nothing, which was exactly right. The summers asked everything of him. The trees, neglected so long, needed more than bees. They needed the care a man gives things he believes in again. Eli thinned the heaviest clusters by hand so the branches would not break under their own promise. Working tree by tree down the long rows, his shirt soaked through by mid-morning, he propped the most loaded limbs with forked poles cut from the woodlot. He cleared the grass and brush from the trunks, hauled water in the dry weeks from the well by the northern spy, and pruned out the dead wood he'd let accumulate in the years he'd half given up. And all the while he kept the bees, checked the hives for the mites Delia had taught him to fear, watched the brood patterns, split a colony that grew too crowded and threatened to swarm, catching the old queen and settling her in a new box with a calm that would have astonished the April version of himself. Lost 2 hives to a sickness he caught early, thanks to Delia, and saved the rest. Took his first real honey in July, framed so heavy with capped comb that his arms shook lifting them, and spun it out in a borrowed extractor in the barn, the whole building going thick and golden with the smell. Theo and Junie came for the first extraction, and Eli let the boy turn the crank. The honey ran out the spout pale gold and slow, and Theo caught a taste on his finger and his eyes went round. "It tastes like flowers," he said, amazed. "It tastes like the whole orchard." "That's exactly what it is," Eli said. "Every apple blossom, every bit of clover, all of it. Run through 10,000 bees and come out the other side." He filled a jar for them and capped it. "First honey off this place in its whole history. Your grandmother gets the very first jar." Word of the honey traveled faster than word of the bees had. Delia took some to sell at her own stand and reported back that folks 2 counties over were asking after it. Junie set a single jar on the diner counter, just to show, and the Saturday crowd passed it hand to hand like a curiosity from a far country. The town's tone began very slightly to shift. The man who'd lost his mind was now, perhaps, the man doing something peculiar that seemed improbably to be working. Walt still shook his head, but he'd taken to driving past slow, looking long at the trees, and once Eli caught him simply parked at the fence at dusk, watching the hives glow in the last light, saying nothing at all. By the first week of August, there was no longer any pretending. Eli stood under the northern spy at sunup, and the tree above him was a wall of fruit. Apples crowded the branches shoulder to shoulder, green going gold at the edges, more than the old tree had carried in 15 years. Every tree down every row told the same impossible story. The orchard that the whole town had buried was bent double under the weight of its own harvest. He did the arithmetic standing there and had to lean on the trunk. If the fruit held, if nothing took it now, this would be the largest crop the Mercer orchard had ever given, larger than his father's best year, larger than his grandfather's. He had been right. It is a particular cruelty of farming that the best year and the worst trouble can arrive in the same season. The first blow came from the weather. The radio out of the county seat had been talking for 2 days about a system building to the west. "Hail possible," it said, and high wind, the kind of late summer storm that can undo a year in 20 minutes. Eli knew what hail would do to a tree hung with ripening fruit. It would bruise and pock every apple it touched, knock half the crop to the ground, and turn a record harvest into windfall fit only for the cider press, if that. And the bees, a hard enough blow could topple the stacked hives, soak the colonies, drown a season's work. He spent a day and a night that he could ill afford getting ready. He propped what limbs he could. He strapped the tallest hive stacks with ratchet straps to stakes driven deep, working by lantern, his bad back screaming, Theo's veil hanging empty on its peg because Junie had the sense to keep the boy home with a storm coming. The storm came at 3 in the morning. Eli stood in the barn door and watched it work over the ridge to the west, the lightning showing him the trees in white flashes, bent and lashing. The wind tried to take the barn roof and didn't. The rain came sideways, but the hail tracked north. He watched the worst of it go up the far valley, a gray curtain dragging over somebody else's ground. And he stood in the door with his hands shaking from more than cold, grateful and guilty all at once for the luck of it. By dawn, the storm had blown through. He walked the rows in the dripping gray light and found limbs down and a scatter of fruit on the grass, and 3 hives knocked cockeyed but not lost. Bad but not ruin. He set the hives right with his own hands and breathed again. The weather had only grazed him. The second trouble meant to land square. It came in a county truck 2 days later with a man named Pruitt from the Regional Agricultural Office and a clipboard held against his chest like a shield. Eli met him at the gate with his hat in his hand, polite as he was raised to be. "Mr. Mercer." Pruitt did not get out at first. He looked at the rows of white hives the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. "We've had a complaint. Concerns about an apiary operation of this size, this close to a public road and neighboring properties. 200 colonies, we're told." "Near enough," Eli said. "That's a commercial-scale operation, Mr. Mercer. There are setback requirements, registration requirements, limits, in some zonings, on hive counts near a residence and a county road." Pruitt finally stepped down from the truck, clipboard first. "I'm obligated to inform you we've received a formal complaint and that pending review, you may be required to substantially reduce the number of colonies on this parcel. Possibly remove them entirely." The morning seemed to go very quiet, even with the hum all around them. "Remove them," Eli repeated, "until the parcel's in compliance. I don't make the rules, sir, but a complaint's been filed and I have to act on it." Pruitt had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'd be straight with you. These things can take a season to sort out, and the rules on this aren't all settled. But I can't tell you to ignore it." "A complaint," Eli said slowly. "From who?" Pruitt glanced down the road, toward where Walt's place sat at the bend, and then caught himself and looked at his clipboard instead. He didn't have to answer. Eli had already understood. The bees had pollinated the orchard in May. Their work in the trees was done. The fruit was set. The apples 3 weeks from picking, and the colonies he'd be forced to haul off now had already given the orchard everything it needed from them. But they were also the honey. They were the part of the operation that might, in good years to come, actually pay. And they were the proof, 200 boxes of it, that he had been right, and the town had been wrong. And someone wanted them gone. Eli drove to the county seat the next morning and spent 4 hours in hard chairs outside offices, learning the shape of the thing. It was worse and better than he'd feared, in the way these things usually are. Better, nobody could make him cut down a single tree, and nobody disputed that the orchard was his. The apples were safe. The fruit would ripen on the branch, whatever happened with the paperwork. Worse, the hive rules were a genuine snarl. The county had passed an ordinance years back, in the wake of some dispute Eli had never heard about, limiting apiaries above a certain size near roads and dwellings, unless the keeper held a permit and met setbacks he had never applied for because he'd never known they existed. He was technically out of compliance. A clerk explained, not unkindly, that the complaint forced their hand. He could apply for a variance. It would go before the county board. It would take, she guessed, 2 to 3 months, well past harvest, well into fall, and in the meantime he was supposed to reduce his colonies to the permitted number, which for his setbacks was closer to 30 than 200. To do that, he'd have to sell off or give away the better part of his bees at the worst possible time of year, breaking up colonies he'd nursed all season, losing the honey crop still curing in the hives, dismantling in a week what had taken him half a year and most of his savings to build. He understood, sitting in those hard chairs, exactly how the thing was meant to work. Not a wall, but a slow bleed. Make the right path so expensive and so slow that a tired man simply gives up and clears the ground after all, which had been the advice from the start. He thought about Walt. He was nearly certain it was Walt, and the certainty sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. 40 years of borrowed tools and shared fence mending and coffee at the diner. He could not make it square with the man who'd filed a paper to take his bees. He did not go and confront him. That was not Eli's way, and besides, he wasn't certain, and a man does not accuse on a feeling. Instead, he drove home the long way, past Junie's, and found her closing up the diner, and he told her all of it, sitting at the counter with the chairs already up on the tables. Junie listened the whole way through without interrupting, which was her gift. Then she was quiet a while. 2 to 3 months, she said finally, and the apples come in 3 weeks. Yes, so they can't touch the orchard, just the bees. The bees are most of what I sank into this, Eli said, and they're the part that'd carry it forward. Without them, it's one good apple year and then back to where I was. He turned his coffee cup in its saucer. I could fight the variants, might even win it, given time. But not before they make me haul the colonies off. And once they're broken up and sold in August, the year's gone whether I win in November or not. Junie was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. And if it was Walt, she said carefully, who filed it? What do you mean to do about that? Eli was a long time answering. Nothing, he said at last. I don't know it was him. And even if I did, a man who'd do that out of spite or fear, what's there to say to him? You can't argue somebody into being decent. He shook his head. No, I'm not going to fight a person. I'm going to fight the problem. There's a difference, and I learned it a long time ago. He didn't yet know how. He only knew the shape of what he was up against. A rule he'd broken without meaning to, a clock running against him, a harvest coming in fast, and somewhere down the road a neighbor who, for reasons of his own, wanted the white boxes and everything they proved gone before the town could see them in their glory. He drove home in the dark and did not sleep. The reduction notice came Friday. It was official now, on county paper. He had until the end of the month to bring his colonies into compliance, down to 30, or plus fines that mounted by the day. The end of the month was 11 days off. The apples were 2 weeks from picking. The honey was not yet ready to pull. Eli stood in the dooryard with the paper in his hand and felt, for the first time since Theo had counted 41 bees on the leaning tree, genuinely beaten. He had been right about everything. The trees had come back. The orchard groaned with the best fruit of its life, and it would not matter, because they were going to make him tear out the engine of it 11 days before he could prove a thing. He walked the orchard that evening with no work in his hands, which was a rare and terrible thing for him. The light came down gold through the loaded branches, and the bees were finishing their day, drifting home heavy, and the whole place was as beautiful as it had ever been in his life. That was the cruelty of it. He had wanted, more than he'd admitted, even to himself, to walk Walt and the diner crowd and the whole skeptical town through these rows at harvest and let the fruit do the talking. To not say I told you so. He was not built for that, but to simply stand among it and let them see. He sat down on the grass under the northern spy, the way he had as a boy, and put his back against the trunk his grandfather had planted, and he was tired all the way down. He thought about clearing the ground after all, selling the bees while they were worth something, taking the one apple year as a gift and asking for nothing more. Then he heard a small sound and looked up. Theo had come with Junie in the gathering dark, and the boy was standing at the end of the row with his notebook, drawing the loaded trees by the last of the light, utterly absorbed, getting it all down so it would not be forgotten. The boy was making a record, proof in a child's careful hand that the orchard had lived, and Eli sat up straight. Proof, that was the whole of it. The county had a rule and a complaint and a clock. But Eli had something the complaint hadn't counted on. The truth was on his side, and the truth was visible. 200 hives. An orchard buried in fruit it hadn't borne in 20 years. A season's work that anyone with eyes could read in 5 minutes. The fight wasn't in an office against a man he couldn't name and wouldn't accuse. The fight was out here, in the open, in front of everybody. He stood up and brushed off his trousers. Junie, he called. How fast can you spread word in this town? The plan came together over a single long night at Junie's counter, the two of them with a county map and a calendar, and Delia on the telephone from 2 counties over, all of them talking at once. The variance process was slow because it happened in a quiet room with a clipboard. So Eli would not let it be quiet. He had 11 days. He would not spend them hauling away bees. He would spend them making the orchard impossible to ignore. First, the rules themselves. Delia knew the ordinance better than the clerk who'd quoted it, because she'd watched it pass and had fought a version of it herself. The setback limits, she pointed out, applied to colonies within a certain distance of the road and the property line. Eli had nearly 40 acres. The far back rows of the orchard, up the slope by the woodlot, sat well beyond every setback in the ordinance. There was nothing in the rule that said where on his own land the hives had to be, only how close they could come to the road and the neighbors. You don't have to get rid of them, Delia said. You have to move them back into compliance. It's a brutal amount of work in 11 days, but it's legal, and they can't say a word. Moving 200 hives by hand uphill was very nearly more than one 61-year-old man could do, so he did not do it alone. That was Junie's part, and she was better at it than Eli could ever have been. She put the single jar of honey back on the diner counter, and beside it she put Theo's notebook, open to the drawings, the empty silent tree in April, the same tree singing in May, the branches bent with fruit in August, all of it in a child's careful hand with the dates marked. She told the story to every soul who sat at her counter, and she let the notebook tell the rest. And the town, which had been quietly watching the white boxes all summer, and tasting that honey and driving, past slow came. They came on a Saturday, 2 days before the deadline. They came in trucks with tailgates down, the young men from the feed store and the volunteer fire crew, and half the Saturday market, in long sleeves and gloves, a little nervous of the bees and game anyway. Delia drove in with 3 other beekeepers from her county who knew how to move colonies in the cool of early morning when the foragers were still home. They strapped the hives and lifted them to a handcart and walked them up the slope, row by row, all morning long, the whole orchard loud with the work of it. Eli moved among them, showing the gentle way, the slow way, and not one person was stung worse than a nettle, because the bees, as he'd said all along, didn't want trouble any more than he did. By noon, every hive sat above the setback line, ranked in new rows along the high ground by the woodlot, perfectly undeniably legal. Pruitt himself drove out. Somebody had made sure he'd hear, and walked the line with his clipboard and his tape and found, to what looked like his private relief, nothing he could write up. The colonies were in compliance. The complaint had nothing left to stand on. But the moving of the hives was only half of what happened that day, and the smaller half, because once the work was done, the people did not leave. Junie had seen to that too. She'd had the diner cooking since dawn, and she set up tables in the dooryard, and what had started as a work crew turned into the first thing the Mercer orchard had hosted in a generation. And Eli, who was not built for "I told you so," did the only thing he was built for instead. He walked them through the rows. He walked the whole town through his orchard at the height of its best year. He let them stand under the northern spy his grandfather had planted and look up into a wall of ripening fruit. He showed them the leaning Gravenstein that had stood silent 4 springs, and now hung so heavy he'd had to prop it with poles. He told them, plainly and without heat, what had been wrong. Not old wood, not played-out ground, but silence. No one had come to carry the pollen, and so the blossoms had fallen, and how the bees had fixed in one season what everyone had been so sure was beyond fixing. He did not once say that they'd been wrong. He didn't have to. The fruit said it, hanging gold and impossible over their heads, and you could watch the town read it in real time, the old verdict crumbling, replaced by something that looked a good deal like wonder. Walt came. Eli had not expected him, and there was a moment when the older man appeared at the edge of the dooryard that the whole gathering seemed to hold its breath, because by then enough people had guessed where the complaint had come from. Walt stood a long while at the end of a row, looking up at the fruit. Then he came and found Eli, and he took off his hat, and his face was the face of a man who has had a hard conversation with himself. "I filed it," he said low, just to Eli. "The complaint." Eli. I'd told everybody for years it couldn't be done. Told it so long I think I needed it to stay true. And then there it all was, working, and he stopped. It was a small, sorry thing to do. I've been sick over it a week. Eli looked at him a long moment. Then he reached up into the branch above them, twisted off an apple, the first ripe one he'd picked all year, and held it out. 40 years, Walt, he said quietly. I'm not about to lose a friend over a bad week. Eat the apple. Walt took it. His hand was not quite steady. He bit into it, and his eyes closed, and when he opened them, they were wet. Lord, he said, I'd forgotten. I'd plain forgotten what these tasted like. So had I, said Eli. For a while there, so had I. By the road stood the hand-painted sign, Honey and Apples. Behind it, the white boxes hummed in their new rows up the high ground, and the old trees bent gold and heavy under the finest crop the Mercer orchard had ever borne. Eli walked between them without hurry, without netting, the whole hillside trembling with that sound like the earth breathing. Junie sat on the porch with her coffee. Theo ran the rows counting bees he could no longer keep up with, his notebook full. And down at the fence, Walt was parked again at dusk, but inside the gate now, sleeves rolled up, learning the gentle way to lift a frame. The orchard had not needed clearing. It had only needed someone patient enough to bring it back to life.